The series of presidential primary elections and caucuses held in each U.S. state and territory is part of the nominating process of United States presidential elections. This process was never included in the United States Constitution, and thus was created over time by the political parties. Some states only hold primary elections, some only hold caucuses, and others use a combination of both. These primaries and caucuses are staggered generally between January and June before the general election in November. The primary elections are run by state and local governments, while caucuses are private events that are directly run by the political parties themselves. A state's primary election or caucus is usually an indirect election. Instead of voters directly selecting a particular person running for president, they determine how many delegates each party's national convention will receive from their respective state. These delegates then in turn select their party's presidential nominee. Each party determines how many delegates are allocated to each state. Along with those delegates chosen during the primaries and caucuses, state delegations to both the Democratic and Republican conventions also include unpledged delegates, usually current and former elected office holders and party leaders, who can vote for whoever they want. This system of presidential primaries and caucuses is somewhat controversial because of his staggered nature. The major advantage is that candidates can concentrate their resources in each area of the country one at a time instead of campaigning in every state simultaneously. However, the overall results may not be representative of the U.S. electorate as a whole. Voters in Iowa, New Hampshire and other small states which traditionally hold their primaries and caucuses first usually have a major impact on the races, while voters in California and other large states which traditionally hold their primaries last in June generally end up having no say because the races are usually over by then. As a result, more states vie for earlier primaries to claim a greater influence in the process. Both major political parties of the U.S. the Democratic Party and the Republican Party officially nominate their candidate for president at their respective national conventions. Each of these conventions is attended by a number of delegates selected in accordance with the given party's bylaws. Both parties operate with two types of delegates, pledged and unpledged. The group of unpledged delegates, also known as superdelegates, generally comprising current and former elected office holders and party leaders, are free to vote for any candidate they wish at the convention. The group of pledged delegates, comprising delegates representing the party committee of each state, are expected to vote in accordance with the rules of their state party. Depending on state law and state party rules, when voters cast ballots for a candidate in a presidential caucus or primary, they may be voting to actually award delegates bound to vote for a particular candidate at the state or national convention, or they may simply be expressing an opinion that the state party is not bound to follow in selecting delegates to the national convention. In recent elections, the eventual nominees were known well before the actual conventions took place. The last time a major party's nominee was not clear before the convention was in 1976, when incumbent President Gerald Ford narrowly defeated Ronald Reagan. Types of primaries and caucuses. Franchise in a primary or caucus is governed by rules established by the state party, although the states may impose other regulations. While most states hold primary elections, a handful of states hold caucuses. Instead of going to a polling place, voters attend local private events run by the political parties, and cast their selections there. The advantage of caucuses is that the state party runs the process directly instead of having the state and local governments run them. The disadvantage is that most election laws do not normally apply to caucuses. Nearly all states have a binding primary or caucus, in which the results of the election legally bind some or all of the delegates to vote for a particular candidate at the national convention, for a certain number of ballots or until the candidate releases the delegates. Some binding primaries are winner-take-all contests, in which all of a state's delegates are required to vote for the same candidate. In a proportional vote, a state's delegation is allocated in proportion to the candidate's percent of the popular vote. In many of those states that have proportional vote primaries, a candidate must meet a certain threshold in the popular vote to be given delegates. A handful of states practice non-binding primaries or caucuses, which may select candidates to a state convention, which then in turn selects delegates to the national convention. A couple of states like Iowa have an additional step in their non-binding primaries or caucuses where voters instead elect delegates to county conventions. The county conventions then in turn elect delegates to the state conventions, and so on. In many states, only voters registered with a party may vote in that party's primary, known as a closed primary. In some states, a semi-closed primary is practiced, in which voters unaffiliated with a party may choose a party primary in which to vote. In an open primary, any voter may vote in any party's primary. In all of these systems, a voter may participate in only one primary. That is, a voter who casts a vote for a candidate standing for the Republican nomination for president cannot cast a vote for a candidate standing for the Democratic nomination, or vice versa. A few states once staged a blanket primary, in which voters could vote for one candidate in multiple primaries, but the practice was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 2000 case of California Democratic Party v. Jones as violating the freedom of assembly guaranteed by the First Amendment. Delegate selection rules both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party usually modify their delegate selection rules between presidential elections, including how delegates are allocated to each state and territory. Under the current Democratic Party selection rules, adopted in 2006, delegates are selected under proportional representation, which requires a candidate have a minimum of 15% of a state's popular vote to receive delegates. In addition, the Democratic Party may reject any candidate under their bylaws. Each state publishes a delegate selection plan that notes the mechanics of calculating the number of delegates per congressional district, and how votes are transferred from local conventions to the state and national convention. Since the 2012 Democratic primaries, the number of pledged delegates allocated to each of the 50 U.S. states and Washington, D.C. is based on two main factors: the proportion of votes each state gave to the Democratic candidate in the last three presidential elections, and the number of electoral votes each state has in the United States Electoral College. States who schedule their primary or caucus later in the primary season may also get additional bonus delegates. The Republican Party's rules since 2008 leave more discretion to the states in choosing a method of allocating delegates. As a result, states variously applied the statewide winner-take-all method, district and state-level winner-take-all, or proportional allocation. Changes in the rules before 2012 brought proportional representation to more states. Also, 3 delegates are allocated for each congressional district. For at-large ones elected statewide, each state gets at least 10, plus additional bonus delegates based on whether it has a Republican governor, it has GOP majorities in one or all chambers of his state legislature, and whether it has GOP majorities in its delegation to the U.S. Congress, among other factors. Each party's bylaws also specify which current and former elected officeholders and party leaders qualify as unpledged delegates. Because of possible deaths, resignations, or the results of intervening or special elections, the final number of these superdelegates may not be known until the week of the convention. Calendar: campaigning for president often begins almost a year before the New Hampshire primary, almost 2 years before the presidential election. This is largely because federal campaign finance laws including the Federal Election Campaign Act state that a candidate who intends to receive contributions aggregating in excess of $5,000 or make expenditures aggregating in excess of $5,000, among others, must first file a statement of candidacy with the Federal Election Commission. Thus, presidential candidates officially announce their intentions to run that early so they can start raising or spending the money needed to mount their nationwide campaigns. The election dates for 2016, up to and including Super Tuesday are as follows: February 1, Iowa caucus, February 9, New Hampshire primary, February 20, Nevada Democratic caucuses and South Carolina Republican primary, February 23, Nevada Republican caucuses, February 27, South Carolina Democratic primary, March 1, Super Tuesday, primaries caucuses for both parties in several states. Iowa and New Hampshire. The first binding event, in which a candidate can secure convention delegates, is traditionally the Iowa caucus, usually held in January of the presidential election year. It is generally followed by the New Hampshire primary, the first primary by tradition since 1920 and by New Hampshire state law. New Hampshire law states the primary shall be held on the Tuesday at least 7 days immediately preceding the date on which any other state shall hold a similar election. The Iowa caucuses are not considered to be a similar election under New Hampshire's law because the former uses caucuses instead of primary elections. Should any other state move its primary too close to New Hampshire's, or before, the New Hampshire Secretary of State is required to reschedule the primary accordingly. In recent elections, the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary have garnered over half the media attention paid to the entire selection process. Because these states are small, campaigning takes place on a much more personal scale. As a result, even a little-known, underfunded candidate can use retail politics to meet intimately with interested voters and perform better than expected. The Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary have produced a number of headline-making upsets in history. Harry S. Truman ended his re-election bid in 1952 after losing the New Hampshire primary. Lyndon Baines Johnson dropped his 1968 re-election bid after performing far below expectations in the New Hampshire primary. In the 1972 Democratic primaries, George McGovern was initially considered a dark horse, but he had better than expected second-place finishes in Iowa and New Hampshire and eventually won the nomination. Frontrunner Edmund Muskie, who won both contests, instead lost momentum. George H. W. Bush won the Iowa caucus in 1980, leading him to claim that he had Big Mo over frontrunner Ronald Reagan. However, Reagan won the New Hampshire and several other key primaries to take the nomination. However, in the 1988 Republican presidential nomination, Bush, serving as Reagan's vice president, unexpectedly finished third in Iowa, which Bob Dole won. Dole was also leading in New Hampshire polls but ended up losing that primary as he failed to counterattack ads from Bush. Bush had no serious trouble clinching the nomination afterward. Gary Hart was initially not considered a serious contender in 1984, which featured former Vice President Walter Mondale as the frontrunner. However, Hart had a respectable showing in Iowa and then stunned Mondale in New Hampshire, the latter where Hart had started campaigning months earlier. This resulted in a long primary battle, with Mondale eventually emerging as the nominee after Super Tuesday 3. Pat Buchanan's second-place showing in the 1992 and win in the 1996 New Hampshire primaries coincided with the weakness of the future nominees, incumbent George H. W. Bush, and Senator Bob Dole respectively. Bush and Dole subsequently lost the general election. In 1992, then-Governor Bill Clinton's better-than-expected second-place finish in New Hampshire salvaged his campaign and he went on to win the nomination, following on to be elected president with a 43% plurality. Senator John McCain upset George W. Bush in the New Hampshire primary in 2000. Bush's front-runner campaign had initially not expected serious opposition after other potential candidates like Elizabeth Dole and Dan Quayle decided not to run. McCain's newfound momentum ended after his defeat in the South Carolina primary, and though he pulled out wins in Michigan and his home state of Arizona, his campaign was ended by Super Tuesday. In the 2004 primaries, John Kerry, whose campaign had been sagging in prior months, won the Iowa caucus while John Edwards unexpectedly finished second, over heavily favored Howard Dean and Richard Gephardt. Gephardt immediately ended his campaign, while Dean's post-concession speech drew negative attention. Kerry went on to overcome Dean's initial lead in New Hampshire to win that primary, and eventually the Democratic presidential nomination. In 2008, frontrunner Hillary Rodham Clinton, whose campaign initially banked on a knockout victory in Iowa, unexpectedly finished third in that caucus behind winner Barack Obama and John Edwards. Clinton then pulled off a comeback victory in New Hampshire where Obama had been leading the polls. Although Obama and Clinton were largely well matched in most of the subsequent primaries, Obama's better organization and uncontested caucus victories were crucial to him winning the Democratic nomination. In 2008, John McCain, initially struggling among Republican contenders in 2007, decided to skip Iowa and concentrate on New Hampshire, and McCain's win rejuvenated his presidential campaign and he became the Republican nominee. Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney, two candidates who had each led in the polls in 2007, did not perform as expected in Iowa and New Hampshire. In 2012, Mitt Romney was initially reported to be the first Republican non-incumbent presidential candidate, since the Iowa caucus started in 1976, to win both the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire primary. However, a final count released by the Iowa State Party 16 days after the caucus contest reported Santorum as the winner by 34 votes over Romney, but by then Romney had already won New Hampshire by a comfortable margin. Subsequent primaries and caucuses equals, after Iowa and New Hampshire, primaries and caucuses are held in the other states, Puerto Rico, insular areas, and the District of Columbia. The frontrunners attempt to solidify their status, while the others fight to become number two. For the Republicans, the South Carolina primary is considered a firewall to protect establishment favorites and frontrunners in the presidential nomination race, being designed to stop the momentum of insurgent candidates who could have received a boost from strong showings in Iowa and New Hampshire. From its inception in 1980 through the election of 2008, the winner of the South Carolina Republican presidential primary has gone on to win the nomination. In the 2012 Republican primaries, Newt Gingrich initially finished poorly in the early states, but then scored an upset victory in South Carolina over frontrunner Mitt Romney. However, after suffering a decisive defeat to Romney in Florida, Gingrich's campaign was relegated back to third place and left Rick Santorum as the main challenger. Super Tuesday is the Tuesday in February or March when the greatest number of states hold primary elections. Because it is held in various states from geographically and socially diverse regions of the country, it typically represents a presidential candidate's first test of national electability. More delegates can be won on Super Tuesday than on any other single day of the primary calendar, thus convincing wins during this day have usually propelled candidates to their party's nomination. Each party sets its own calendar and rules, and in some cases actually administers the election. However, to reduce expenses and encourage turnout, the major parties' primaries are usually held the same day and may be consolidated with other state elections. The primary election itself is administered by local governments according to state law. In some cases, state law determines how delegates will be awarded and who may participate in the primary. Where it does not, party rules prevail. In recent years, states have been holding increasingly early primaries to maximize their leverage. In reaction to these moves, both the Democratic and Republican national committees have tried to impose a timing tier system of scheduling rules, stripping states of delegates if they move their primaries early. But this still did not prevent a few states from moving their primaries in both 2008 and 2012 anyway. History: there is no provision for the role of political parties in the United States Constitution. Before 1820, Democratic-Republican members of Congress would nominate a single candidate from their party. That system collapsed in 1824, and since 1832 the preferred mechanism for nomination has been a national convention. Delegates to the National Convention were usually selected at state conventions whose own delegates were chosen by district conventions. Sometimes they were dominated by intrigue between political bosses who controlled delegates. The National Convention was far from democratic or transparent. Progressive-era reformers looked to the primary election as a way to measure popular opinion of candidates, as opposed to the opinion of the bosses. In 1910, Oregon became the first state to establish a presidential preference primary, which requires delegates to the National Convention to support the winner of the primary at the convention. By 1912, 12 states either selected delegates in primaries, used a preferential primary, or both. By 1920 there were 20 states with primaries, but some went back, and from 1936 to 1968, 12 states used them. The primary received its first major test in the 1912 election, pitting incumbent President William Howard Taft against challengers Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette. Roosevelt proved the most popular candidate, But as most primaries were non-binding preference shows and held in only 14 of the then 48 states, the Republican nomination went to Taft, who controlled the convention. Seeking to boost voter turnout, New Hampshire simplified its ballot access laws in 1949. In the ensuing beauty contest of 1952, Republican Dwight Eisenhower demonstrated his broad voter appeal by outpolling the favored Robert A. Taft, Mr. Republican. Also, Democrat Estes Kefauver defeated incumbent President Harry S. Truman, leading the latter to decide not to run for another term. The first in the nation New Hampshire primary has since become a widely observed test of candidates' viability. The impetus for national adoption of the binding primary election was the chaotic 1968 Democratic National Convention. Vice President Hubert Humphrey secured the nomination despite not winning a single primary under his own name. After this, a Democratic National Committee Commission panel led by Senator George McGovern the McGovern-Fraser Commission recommended that states adopt new rules to assure wider participation. A large number of states, faced with the need to conform to more detailed rules for the selection of national delegates, chose a presidential primary as an easier way to come into compliance with the new National Democratic Party rules. The result was that many more future delegates would be selected by a state presidential primary. The Republicans also adopted many more state presidential primaries. With the broadened use of the primary system, states have tried to increase their influence in the nomination process. One tactic has been to create geographic blocks to encourage candidates to spend time in a region. Vermont and Massachusetts attempted to stage a joint New England primary on the first Tuesday of March, but New Hampshire refused to participate so it could retain its traditional place as the first primary. The first successful regional primary was Super Tuesday of March 8, 1988, in which 9 Southern states united in the hope that the Democrats would select a candidate in line with Southern interests. It failed as all but 2 of the 8 major candidates won at least one primary on that day. Another trend is to stage earlier and earlier primaries, given impetus by Super Tuesday and the mid-1990s move of the California primary and its block of votees the largest in the nation from June to March. To retain its tradition as the first primary in the country, New Hampshire moved their primary forward, from early March to early January. A major reason why states try to increase their influence, and vie for earlier primaries, is because in recent years the races were usually over before the primary season ended in June. For example, John McCain officially clinched the 2008 Republican presidential nomination in March, while during that same month Barack Obama held an insurmountable lead and pledged delegates in the Democratic Party primaries. In 2012, Obama faced no major challenger in the Democratic Party primaries since he had the advantage of incumbency, while Mitt Romney gained enough delegates to be declared the presumptive Republican nominee by late April. In 2012, both the Republicans and the Democrats moved their Florida primary to January 31, which was an earlier date than past election cycles. In response, other states also changed their primary election dates for 2012, in order to claim a greater influence, creating a cascade of changes in other states. This followed what happened in 2008 when Nevada moved its caucuses to January, causing other states to also move its primaries to earlier dates. Both parties then enacted stricter timing rules for 2016, primaries and caucuses cannot start until February 1. And only Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina and Nevada are entitled to February contests. In U.S. territories the primary and caucus system is the only method in which voters in Puerto Rico, Guam, and other U.S. territories can have a say in the presidential race. Under the U.S. Constitution, U.S. territories are not represented in the Electoral College, and thus voters residing in those areas are basically ineligible to vote in the general election. On the other hand, as stated above, the primaries and caucuses were largely created by the political parties. Both the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as other third parties, eventually agreed to let these territories participate in the presidential nomination process. Advantage of incumbency an incumbent president seeking re-election usually faces no opposition during their respective parties' primaries, especially if they're still popular. For Presidents Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, their respective paths to nomination became uneventful and the races become merely pro forma. Serious challenges are rare, but then generally presage disaster during the general election in the fall. During the 1976 Republican Party primaries, then-former California Governor Reagan carried 23 states while running against incumbent President Gerald Ford. Ford then went on to lose Jimmy Carter. Senator Ted Kennedy then carried 12 states while running against Carter during the 1980 Democratic Party primaries. Reagan then defeated Carter in the fall. Pat Buchanan captured a decent percentage of the national popular vote against George H. W. Bush during the 1992 Republican primaries, but only received a handful of delegates. Bush subsequently went on to lose in the general election to Clinton. Criticisms representativeness because they are the states that traditionally hold their respective contests first. The Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary usually attract the most media attention. However, critics, such as Mississippi Secretary of State Eric Clark and Tennessee Senator William Brock, point out that these states are not representative of the United States as a whole. They are overwhelmingly white, more rural, and wealthier than the national average, and neither is in the fast-growing West or South. Conversely, states that traditionally hold their primaries in June, like California and New Jersey, usually end up having no say in who the presidential candidate will be. As stated above, the races were usually over well before June. California and New Jersey moved their primaries to February for the 2008 election, but in 2012 both states ended up moving them back to June. In 2005, the Primary Commission of the Democratic National Committee began considering removing Iowa and New Hampshire from the top of the calendar, but this proposal never gained approval, so those two states remain as the first two contests. New Hampshire also fought back by obliging candidates who want to campaign in the state to pledge to uphold that primary as the first one. Front-loading and compression states vie for earlier primaries to claim greater influence in the nomination process, as the early primaries can act as a signal to the nation, showing which candidates are popular and giving those who perform well early on the advantage of the bandwagon effect. Also, candidates can ignore primaries that fall after the nomination has already been secured, and would owe less to those states politically. As a result, rather than stretching from March to July, most primaries take place in a compressed time frame in February and March. National party leaders also have an interest in compressing the primary calendar, as it enables the party to reduce the chance of a bruising internecine battle and to preserve resources for the general campaign. In such a primary season, however, many primaries will fall on the same day, forcing candidates to choose where to spend their time and resources. Indeed, Super Tuesday was created deliberately to increase the influence of the South. When states cannot agree to coordinate primaries, however, attention flows to larger states with large numbers of delegates at the expense of smaller ones. Because the candidate's time is limited, paid advertising may play a greater role. Moreover, a compressed calendar limits the ability of lesser-known candidates to corral resources and raise their visibility among voters, especially when a better-known candidate enjoys the financial and institutional backing of the party establishment. In an article from Detroit News, Tennessee Senator William Brock said about front-loading, "Today too many people in too many states have no voice in the election of our major party nominees. For them, the nominations are over before they have begun." Reform proposals. There are several proposals for reforming the primary system. Some have called for a single nationwide primary to be held on one day. Others point out that requiring candidates to campaign in every state simultaneously would exacerbate the purported problem of campaigns being dominated by the candidates who raise the most money. The following proposals attempt to return the primary system to a more relaxed schedule, and would help less funded candidates by lowering the cost of entry. Graduated random presidential primary system. One reform concept is the graduated random presidential primary system, variations of which have been referred to as the American Plan or the California Plan. This plan starts with small primaries, and gradually moves up to larger ones, in 10 steps, with states chosen at random. The idea is that fewer initial primaries, typically in smaller states, would allow grassroots campaigns to score early successes and pick up steam. However, since states are chosen at random, travel costs may still be significant. Delaware Plan A commission impaneled by the Republican National Committee recommended the Delaware Plan in 2000. This plan had states grouped by size into 4 groups, with the smallest primaries first, then the next smallest, and so on. Populous states objected to the plan, however, because it would have always scheduled their primaries at the end of the season. Other criticisms included the wide geographic range of the states, necessitating high travel costs. The Delaware Plan was put to vote at Republican National Convention of 2000 and rejected. Rotating regional primary system The National Association of Secretaries of State has endorsed a rotating regional primary system, with the country split into 4 regions, the West, the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast. Unlike the Delaware Plan and the American Plan, the rotating regional primary system would lower campaigning costs by restricting groups of primaries to single, contiguous regions. Author and political scientist Larry J. Sabato is also a proponent of this plan, but his proposal would have the order of regional primaries determined by lottery on January 1 of each presidential election year instead of on a rotating basis. In addition, his plan would allow for a few small population states, such as Iowa and New Hampshire, to hold their primaries in advance of the first region. Criticisms of the regional plan include the higher entry costs than the other plans, and the political bias of certain regions unduly influencing the selection of a nominee. Interregional primary plan In the interregional primary plan, the country is divided into geographical regions. On each primary date from March to June, 1 state from each of 6 regions votes. Each election date would contain a wide variety of perspectives. The order of the states in each region is set by a lottery. In a 24-year cycle, every state would have a chance to be among the first primary states. The primary criticism of this plan is that travel costs would be quite high. In each round, candidates would essentially have to cover the entire country to campaign effectively. Contrary to most reform plans, this would reduce the ability of lesser-funded candidates to build up from small contests to large ones. National primary A national primary has been proposed, a single day on which all state primaries and caucuses would be held, with over 120 bills offered in Congress. Timing adjustment In the 2008 Republican primary, states that ran early primaries were punished by a reduction of 50% in the number of delegates they could send to the National Convention. Extension of this idea would set timing tiers, under which states that ran earlier primaries would send proportionally fewer delegates to the National Convention, and states that waited would get a higher proportional number of delegates to the convention. For example, the party allowed primaries before March 1 to send 40% of delegates. Those during March could send 60%. Those during April could send 80%. Those during May could send 100%. And those during June could send 120%. The effect of such a plan would be clumping of primaries at the beginning of each month. It would still allow states to determine the timing of their own primaries, while giving them some incentive to hold primaries later. The disadvantage of the timing adjustment method is that it does not reduce travel time as the regional plans do, although it does permit regional groups of states to voluntarily clump together in a single superprimary as they have done in the past. In practice, however, this timing tier system did not prevent states from moving their primaries in 2008 and 2012. For example, during the 2012 Republican primary, Florida and several other states still moved their primaries to earlier dates despite being penalized delegates. Both parties then enacted more severe penalties in 2016 for violating their timing rules. For Republicans, states with more than 30 delegates that violate the timing rules will be deprived of all their delegates but 9. States with less than 30 will be reduced to 6. For Democrats, States violating these rules will be penalized half of their pledged delegates and all of their unpledged delegates. Lists of primaries. See also, United States presidential election debates, United States Electoral College, Ames straw poll on a Saturday in August prior to the election year, from 1979 to 2011. Democratic Party presidential primaries, 2016, Republican Party presidential primaries, 2016. Notes. References, Brereton Charles. First in the Nation, New Hampshire and the Premier Presidential Primary. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Peter E. Randall Publishers, 1987. Kendall, Kathleen E. Communication in the Presidential Primaries, Candidates and the Media, 1912 2000, Hugh, Greg. First in the Nation Presidential Primary, State of New Hampshire Manual for the General Court, No. 55, 1997. Palmer, Niall A. The New Hampshire Primary and the American Electoral Process, Reed, Labor-Aided Nevada with Demos, Arizona Daily Star, July 24, 2006. Sabato, Larry, Politics, America's Missing Constitutional Link, Virginia Quarterly Review, Summer 2006, 149 61. Scala, Dante J. Stormy Weather, The New Hampshire Primary and Presidential Politics, Where, Alon. The American Direct Primary, Party Institutionalization and Transformation in the North, A British Perspective. External links, List of states by primary type, Petition for an American National Primary and Dialogue about Election Reform.